There are places in history that seem fixed: slabs of concrete and barbed wire, watchtowers and floodlights, monuments to an idea that once felt permanent. The Berlin Wall was one of them. For 28 years, it divided a city, and with it, the lives of millions. It cast a long, practical shadow. Missing birthdays, interrupted careers, whispered plans, people pressed against iron gates, the grind of checkpoints and passports. It sounded like boots and radios, like the distant toll of trains that could not pass. And for those who lived beside it, the wall was not just a barrier to movement. It was a line that shaped how the world looked, how time felt, how hope and fear were measured. On a damp November evening in 1989, the city that had learned to live on either side of that line waited as if holding its breath. The long months of protest, the trickle of escape routes through Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the steady erosion of authority in capitals both near and far, all had loosened what once seemed immovable. In the short, fluorescent-lit conference room where a statement was to be read, a small human error would meet a vast patient impatience. What followed would look like chaos, and in its own way, like grace. What collapsed that night was not a single wall, but a system of expectations. For years, the division had been enforced by law and by routine. Official announcements were carefully timed and deliberately phrased. Changes arrived like tectonic shifts announced on government stationery, filtered through ministries and committees. In the months before November, the engine of change had been slow but inexorable. People in East Berlin and across the German Democratic Republic had been gathering, not with violence, but with persistent presence. Streets filled on Mondays for weeks on end. Citizens carried candles and songs. The images that reached Western televisions told of crowds larger than arrests, of state authority growing thinner where it touched the surface of the street. Across borders, other cracks had opened. A government in Budapest decided to remove barbed wire along its frontier with Austria, and East Germans took that opening as an invitation. Thousands traveled west through Hungary, through Yugoslavia, through Czech routes that would not stay closed. The message traveled faster than any decree. If you keep knocking at the edges of a fence, sometimes they will answer with a door. By November, the ruling party in East Berlin had a battered and uncertain face. Leadership had turned over, policies were being re-examined, and an attempt was made to provide a controlled release, a new set of travel regulations that were meant to give citizens a legal path to obtain passes for private travel abroad. The intention was to diffuse pressure without dissolving authority, to let some people go under supervision and thereby keep the rest in line. There was an administrative machinery, memos, a delay for registration, a formal publication that would determine the moment the rules actually took effect. That is the context for a small human moment, an official rustling through notes, a press conference scheduled for the evening, foreign cameras and state broadcasters watching. The statement that was delivered was not a revolutionary manifesto. It was an attempt at controlled reform, but it landed in the receptive air of a city ready to move. The phrasing that reached millions of viewers was understood as meaning that the new permissions were valid immediately. People who had been waiting for years heard the permission they had longed for, as if someone had just opened a gate and stamped a passport with "now." The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Word traveled through television, radio, and the simplest, oldest channels, human mouths and feet. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands flowed toward the border crossings. They came in coats zipped against the chill, clutching documents or nothing at all. Some stood in a kind of dazed impatience. Others sang or cried quietly. At the checkpoints, which had been prepared for formality and footing, soldiers and border guards found themselves facing an altogether different difficulty. An avalanche of people asking for passage, and no clear orders from above. Those guards were trained to control entry with machine-like rigor, to enforce regulations that had been in place for decades. But training does not always predict a night like this. Officers were confronted by neighbors, relatives, strangers, by a humanity that appealed to conscience and common sense more than to doctrine. Command lines were thin, communications were sporadic, and the mood at the crossings moved from confusion to the simple desire to avoid bloodshed. Faced with a growing crowd whose only weapons were persistence and hope, some guards made an extraordinary decision. Using the authority they had locally, they allowed people to pass through. A few opened small gates at first. Then, as the momentum grew, entire checkpoints were swung wide. One crossing in particular became a symbol, a bridge where a single officer finally relented to the pressure of people pressing forward and opened the main gate. The first to walk through stumbled in disbelief, then looked back and smiled. A small ceremonial act, improvised and unannounced, but it multiplied instantly. As more people passed, the scene transformed from a regulated border crossing into a spontaneous public celebration. Cars honked, strangers embraced, cameras recorded faces wet with tears, shoes scuffed with the dust of hurried steps, breath vaporizing in the cold air as hundreds of voices joined together in a sound that was part relief, part exultation. It is tempting to read the night as a single hinge swung by one clumsy sentence. But history is a weave of countless threads, and the press conference slip was a spark in a landscape already tinder dry from years of pressure. The fall of the wall was not only the product of one error, it was the visible end of a long process of civic courage and shifting geopolitics. The Soviet Union, preoccupied in changing itself, signaled through quieter channels that it would not intervene as it had in earlier decades. Across the city, the accumulation of small refusals to accept a divided life, petitions, demonstrations, emigration, the unending grind of ordinary human effort, had already loosened the bolts. Yet the image of that night, a barrier opened not by tanks or treaty, but by a live announcement and a human decision at a gate, captures something essential about how history often turns. Big institutions can be brittle when their authority depends on unchallenged routine. Underneath the steel and concrete, there is always a layer of human choices. A misstatement can be accidental, but the reaction it provokes is charged by the weight it meets, a people's readiness to cross a line. The fall of the wall was therefore not merely an event that happened to Berlin. It was a response from a city and a continent to the slow, steady insistence of ordinary lives insisting on being whole again. In the weeks and months that followed, the wall's physical pieces were chipped away and carted off like remnants of a bad dream. Political structures rearranged themselves faster than anyone had expected. The image of that night, of gates opened and citizens streaming through into a cold, electric dawn, became a symbol for transitions across the globe. What people often remember is the spectacle, a barrier fallen overnight. What history remembers more patiently is the backstory, the decades of courage and the everyday decisions that prepared the ground for that instant. Today, pieces of the wall stand in museums and public squares, painted and scarred in equal measure. They are reminders of what division looks like up close. Rough concrete, rusted metal, the stains of graffiti, and the names scratched into stone. People touch these fragments as if touching a paradox. The palpability of something once so solid that it could be climbed, and yet once so fragile that it could be outmaneuvered by a sentence and a human decision. The memory keeps both sensations, the weight of separation and the lightness of its undoing. There are lessons in that night for any time when structures feel immovable. Bureaucracies and ideologies can appear indestructible until people, quietly or loudly, decide otherwise. Information travels fast in the modern world, and sometimes a slip can become a lever. but more important than the chance that begins change is the readiness of people to act on it. The fall of the wall was not solely the result of a spoken error. It was the culmination of countless acts of refusal, of movement, and of hope given form. If history can speak, it often does so in the voice of those who were patient enough to persevere and brave enough to begin again. The Night the Wall Fell by Mistake is a story about how a single moment can reveal what a long season has already made possible. It suggests that freedom, once it becomes imaginable, moves quicker than any plan. And it leaves behind a quiet truth, that walls may be built in days, but their undoing is the work of many years. And sometimes the final gate is opened by a human who prefers the risk of compassion to the safety of orders. On a cold November night, a city walked itself back into unity, not because a script demanded it, but because people refused to be kept apart any longer. The world watched, and the world learned that what stands between people can fall in an instant when enough of them reach across.